Olá, welcome to the second edition of the Conférence Pour Le Brésil. Antes de nós iniciarmos, gostaria de lembrar a todos que o nosso painel está sendo transmitido em inglês e em português em nosso canal no YouTube. My name is Ana Luisa Chartier, and I'm a master's student at Sciences Po and part of the panel team at Conférence Pour Le Brésil. On behalf of the organizing team, I would like to thank everyone for attending our panel, Reestablishing the Economy and Fighting Inequalities. What are the instruments and the role of the state? This conference is organized by Sciences Po Paris students and alumni, and its central theme is Inequalities and Post-COVID Reconstruction, Perspectives for Brazil. There will be 6 panels and 20 speakers distributed over 2 weeks. In addition to the relentless and voluntary work of our team, we thank our partners Vie Étudiante Sciences Po Political Observatory for Latin America and the Caribbean, Tosini Freire Advogados, Educalibras, TraduPoints, and Headline for enabling us to create a free online event with simultaneous interpreting into English, Portuguese, and Brazilian Sign Language. Before we start with today's panel, I would like to take this opportunity to invite everyone to take part in our next meeting this Sunday, June the 27th at 11 a.m. Brazil time, in which we will debate the theme of the environment, and we will have the participation of Angela Mendes, a social environmental activist and coordinator of the Chico Mendes Committee, Ailton Krenak, writer, activist of the social environmental movement and the defense of the indigenous people's rights, moderated by Felipe Milanés, who is the coordinator of the Ecology Political Working Group from El Sur, Abia Ayala at the Latin American Council of Social Sciences. I would like to thank the panelists and moderators for voluntarily participating in this debate and making this event possible. And now I will give the floor to our debater today, Fábio de Silva, who will introduce the panel and our guests. Thank you very much, Anna. I greet everyone today here who are here at the Conférence Pour Le Brésil, a conference that has been organized by students of the Sciences Po University. I teach at the Oklahoma University. My name is Fábio de Silva. I am part of the Brazilian Studies and part of Abrasa, Brazilian Studies Association. I would like to start this panel by thanking the organizers for the invitation and to let you know of how happy I am for being able to observe that through our youth, and sometimes we do have the privilege to study overseas, and even though they have this great opportunity, these students do not refrain from thinking of their own country and helping their country with debates like this. We are now having a little trouble with the original audio. Okay, and I see that you are selecting the panelists and the themes very critically, so I think it's an honor to be here with you, being part of this. The title of this panel is Democracy and Institutions: How to Strengthen the Debate. When I was thinking of the title of this panel, I was thinking of how to promote debate instead of strengthening it, because being a teacher in the academy, and being an academic, I understand that Brazil is not under easy days. We are under threat. And this is not about any military coups or anything like this, but this is concerning people who have been elected. They are in the power now, and they are working with anything that can represent an obstacle, and they only think of the building of power. And now I see that we have panelists that are here for this sort of debate. First of all, Renata Giannini, she is representing the civil society. She's a senior researcher at the Igarapé Institute. and she has worked as a consultant for the World Bank, for example, and uh, her key areas of interest include public security, civic engagement, violence prevention, and violence against women and girls, and women, peace, and security data. And then we also have Emmanuel Colombié. He's here representing the press. He has worked with Yahoo Finanças and Valor Econômico, and since 2015, he coordinates the Reporters Without Borders, representing and mediating assistance, training, and communication activities in Rio. He also works with training and communication activities in Latin America, and he works as a spokesperson for the organization in Spanish and Portuguese. And last but not least, we have Marcelo Freixo. He is the federal deputy for the PSOL in Rio, and he is a history teacher, a human rights activist and public security specialist. He was a state deputy in the Legislative Assembly of Rio for 3 terms, and he chaired CPs on militias and on arms and ammunition trafficking, and also the Resistance Committee. In 2012 and 2015, he also was a state deputy for Rio. So I have a first question to the 3 of you. And getting back to what I was starting to say about the democracy in Brazil, and I would like to explore the consequences of this crisis. We know that the Brazilian democracy is living an unstable moment. A lot of protests in Brazil and the car wash operation in 2015 and 2016, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, but the COVID-19 has increased the problems in Brazil. I was seeing that in Santa Catarina there were some attacks from the president to journalists. And this is something that shouldn't, but is becoming something of the quotidian from the daily activities of journalists. And I would like to know what is your opinion regarding the minorities in the House of Representatives. And I'd like to know from you what you think of this deterioration of democracy in Brazil. And what can you say to our society, considering we are so unequal? We're still facing some problems concerning the moderator's internet connection. I was unable to listen to you due to connecting problems, but I would like to, first of all, thank the organizers for being here talking to us for a thing that is so important and up to date, and at the same time, something that concerns such a threat with so important panelists. It's a great responsibility to be able to be here representing the civil society. But getting back to the debate, as mentioned before, it's no news that in Brazil and in Latin America, we are seeing an authoritarian wave of actions. We see a restriction of civic space. I am a civil society representative, and I would like to focus on the space that we have, this layer that is between the family and the state. This is where the civil society can organize itself, and this is the place where we can start to move policies from and to claim for rights and public policies, because this is the civic space. Because what we have been observing is that it's suffering attacks at alarming levels. This space is suffering with attacks since Jair Bolsonaro has started his government, and sometimes the space for democracy and the defense of this space is not necessarily included. But when we look at these most recent academic productions and how democracies die, we see the corrosion of democracy from within. People who think different from the other, this polarity becomes important. We started monitoring at Instituto Igarapé all of the attacks that have been posed to this civic space. We started being attacked as well, especially our executive director, and we came to a typology and the publication that is launched every 3 months is also an example of this. So we need to know what are the tactics that are needed so that we can anticipate some of these attacks and try to react against it. I'd like to talk to you about this. So, but I just want to inform you of this because we've detected this in May last year, and that we have detected 840 attacks to civic space up until June this year. Only this year alone, it's been more than 600 attacks, and these attacks are increasing in number, increasing in intensity in a context in which the country and the world is under a global emergency, and they are getting more serious as well. This is what I want to tell you. The most recurrent type of attack, which correspond to 1/3 of the attacks, are intimidation and harassment. Judiciary or legal threats and harassment is frequent as well. And this is concerning the misuse of these institutions. And this is being made by people who are against the government. In the first 2 years of Bolsonaro's government, we saw that 1/3 of these threats, they refer to fake news and misinformation. And this is extremely important because there are many campaigns, and what called our attention this year was the number of attacks that concern concerning the COVID-19, which contributed with putting Brazil into a central threat to global health. And the third type I would like to mention is the power abuse.
This includes a lot of different things, but two practices that have called our attention are the use of government structure for private interests to try to stop investigations, and something that we call a deviation of the purpose of government is institutions that are key for Brazilian structure, being where you have people who are specialized in the area they are working in, being replaced by people with no necessary experience in the area, but that are aligned with the government. So, and we also see many other things that are happening. Some of them are more strict and strengthening of the way they work, governing by decrees. This is something that is happening a lot, imposing projects that are personal, not taking into consideration the legislative branch of the government, and some behaviors that are very offensive to the civil society, with closing of more informal channels of communication, first closing many of the councils that have a very important role in terms of society's participation, some state surveillance that has increased, with many lists of people who are monitored, and many instances this is done by the judiciary branch. A lot of espionage. We have signs of censorship, and not only the direct censorship and attacks to the press, which I think Emmanuel is going to talk about, but also preventing people from having access to information that should be public, and that is very important for the society to monitor their government, so to see what they're doing. So these are some things that have been happening a lot, some recurring occurrences. And just to close, I'd like to say that we also monitor the response of the institutions. So it's very important to see other institutions working, to see that 30% of the resistance instances seem to be coming from the legislative branch and from the judiciary branch. So I'm going to stop right now, and we can talk about some of these issues later. Thank you, Renata. I was looking at some of these studies. I didn't have access to all the studies you mentioned. Many people who will, in our audience are probably looking for these studies, and I would like to pass the floor on to Emmanuel Colombié. Good morning and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for such an important space. I represent an organization called Reporters Without Borders. We fight for democracy in all continents. And talking specifically about Brazil, you have mentioned some of the recent attacks by the president against the journalists. They have been happening almost every week now. Obviously, Brazilian press works in a toxic environment. The election of Jair Bolsonaro in 2018 was marked by defamation, attacks to the human rights and the journalists, and they started an even more dark time for the press in Brazil, especially in a country where we don't have a tradition of respect. The press was always a comfortable space for governance in Brazil. Many times, the means of communication are in the center of government, helping, and sometimes not. And this tension is nothing new. But with the electoral campaign for Jair Bolsonaro, and his getting into power, marked a transition. We have daily attacks. We have the attractions between the press and the government in the past have been replaced by a constant attack by an authority in the highest level of power. President Bolsonaro, his sons, ministers that are closer to the president and all his structures, they offend structures, and that characterizes a very lack of respect for the press, the work done by the press. Jair Bolsonaro and his sons, and also Vice President Mourão, the SESCOM, the Secretariat of Communication for the government, they all work constantly attacking the press. 85% of the attacks done against the press was done either by the president or by one of his three sons. And from our point of view, this is a strategy that is very well organized to destroy, aimed at destroying the reputation of the press and building the press as a public enemy. This is very serious. This is an image that has been internalized by the followers of the president. This is more constant even against women reporters. And in addition to provoking or encouraging hate, we're having some problems with the audio. They try to control public debate, and this was done in other places. Donald Trump used to do that in the United States. This was done by Maduro in Venezuela. And some examples, Ernesto Araújo, the former foreign minister, some of his declarations were very typical and emblematic of this. He accused the press of telling the president to do something very, how can I say, improper with the conditioned milk that the government was accused of buying in excess. But what they do is do everything and trying to call attention to what they say is a very prejudicial behavior of the press. And this is extremely serious. The construction of public discourse by the government is clear. They try to attribute to the press a very negative position as enemies of states. We're talking about authoritarian and hysterical discourses by the president and his allies. This is not random. This is part of a very well-established strategy. In Brazil, journalism is no longer the subject to criticism. It's being built as the enemy of state. And during these pandemics, the right to information is as important as the right to health. We call this way he works as the Bolsonaro system, and it has increased since the beginning of the pandemics, trying to call attention away from the disastrous strategy used by the government to fight the pandemics. They are accusing the press to be responsible for all the chaos we have in Brazil. In addition to that, the president distributes false information and fake news, recommending the use of medicines such as chloroquine, which are ineffective in the combat against COVID. Its effects have never been never confirmed, and the president was censured even in Twitter due to his compulsive lying. So we have a never seen alliance between organs of the press. This was created in June 2020 with an alliance between communication channels and means to elaborate and communicate its trying to fight against what the president does, which is sending his own bulletins every week. So thank you, Emmanuel. I'm going to pass the floor on to Marcelo Freixo. I hope you are listening to me. I had some problems in my computer and I had to join you through my cell phone. So I apologize for the image, but I think the important thing is that we are able to talk to you. It's a great pleasure to be in the conference with you. Thank you, Fábio. I think a debate with communication professionals is essential for democracy today. And Renata Igarapé is a great partnership of our fight for many years. Michelle, Ilona, great hello to all of you, and congratulations on your work that is essential for the debate on public security and democracy. I think this is even kind of a therapy in a moment where debates are moved by hate. To be able to have a debate led by intelligence, in-depth discussions is essential for the country. I agree with everything I heard. We have a very serious crisis in Brazilian democracy and politics, and that brings a very important reflection.
Bolsonaro is one thing, and the Bolsonarism is another thing, and sometimes they get to meet. And the Bolsonarism will follow after Bolsonaro leaves. Bolsonaro is the product, he's the consequence, he is not the creator of this Bolsonarism. Bolsonarism dialogued with a very deep Brazil, and the deep Brazil is not territorial. It comes from our slavery and the injustice with a chauvinist family raising. And this is the deep Brazil that we are unable to solve. And the Brazilian Republic was unable to solve these questions. It brought the right to vote, but has not ensured the right to life in many sectors. And the democracy is a challenge. For example, how many presidents in Brazil have been elected in a direct voting and secretly, which is a right and democracy? How many of them have been elected and have concluded their term in our republic? You have some time to think. We had Dutra, Juscelino, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Lula, and Dilma in her first term. Only them. They were elected secretly and directly, and they've concluded their time. There is some historical fragility in our history from of which Bolsonarism is fed. It feeds on the crisis, and it's a dramatic crisis that we have. With this said, Bolsonarism has to stand as if it's not a political point of view. This is the strategy, which is a paradox because Bolsonaro has been in politics for 30 years and his family doesn't know how to do any other thing. His 3 kids are politicians. There is no other family that is more involved in politics than Bolsonaro. The extreme right in Brazil has not had more than 10% of votes. Well, Bolsonaro was not the first representative that exists, but he was the one who finally won an election with more than 10% of intention. And when he wins an election, he represents a threat to democracy because he never defended democracy. His politics history starts when we finally started working with our democracy. He started when we were in Geisel government. He was against the political opening in Brazil. He represented dictatorship. He represented the fight against democracy. He is no secret. I'm not saying anything that people don't know, but we have to understand that Bolsonarism is powerful. We need to fight against this, but we need to create elements to strengthen our democracy to fight Bolsonarism. This is the challenge. And both of the things, they walk hand in hand. When we deny democracy, and he does that strategically. I agree with Emmanuel. He has a strategy. When he attacks press, press is policy, is politics. He attacks institutions that represent politics. I cannot govern because of the system. I am different from anything you've had. That's how he puts himself. He puts himself as someone who is not part of the structure or the politics. And then a dispute arises, which is about the concept of democracy. Not a few times he affirms that Brazil is democratic because it follows the will of the majority. He wants to implement an idea of a democracy that is totalitarian, which is a contradicting situation. What is a totalitarian democracy? What is imposed by the majority? When he says Brazil is a Christian country, he says that Brazil is a Christian country because most people are Christian, but he just denies any other religion that there is. And of course, this is a persecution process. Violence is the method he uses. It's not a deviation or an error, it is a method. Hate is the fuel in this Bolsonaristic logic. The book called Engineers of Chaos, and it's very interesting. It has a lot to do with what Renata said and what Emmanuel said as well. Juliano Epone wrote this regarding the extreme right in the world. And he says it is the fusion of cholera and algorithm. And I think this definition is very good. There is cholera, there is a dissatisfaction, and Bolsonaro did not create it. It exploded into 2013. It exploded in Brazil way before Bolsonaro was there wanting to be a president. He is the product of this. Bolsonaro and Bolsonarism read this situation in 2013 and understood it better than anyone else and used it to create strategy. Democracy has crises. Democracy is a crisis in itself because it's a satisfactory place to be, but it's something we pursue, and it is contradicting. If we cannot read this and respond to this systematically, the extreme right is going to respond with the end of democracy. And it happens in the world, not only in Brazil. Just one thing I'd like to talk to Emmanuel to, which is something curious, but I read in João César de Castro Rocha's book, Cultural War and Hate Rhetoric. This crisis of press, Emmanuel, and I agree with you, it is a very strong and central element to understand the Brazilian crisis. The persecution to press happens in general. We need to build the idea that the truth doesn't come from information. Truth is a place of comfort. And this tampers with this cholera. Today, most part of the Brazilians, they get information much from WhatsApp groups, much more than from the press. This is the communication system that represents the power, and the Bolsonarism has used it well. And democracy is not a place where you look for contradiction to understand reality. The world is hostile and violent, so you need to have a place in the world that is uh, that receives us. In WhatsApp groups, information are much easier to come in better than from the newspapers. And this is a power system, so this is why the press is being attacked. This is in the engineering of power. With the crisis of democracy today, we need to understand this is a project. The, pro, the democracy crisis is a project. It's not a lack of capacity from the government. It is a project. This is the Bolsonarism project, and they are advancing in a fast pace. And Renata, one thing to you, something that I find that is terrible. They run over the legislative, the center and the right side that support Bolsonaro. They have 350 votes out of 513. More than 300, they support the president. The end of the environmental license law was approved in one day with more than 300 favorable votes. They don't need reasoning anymore. They just need their own strength. So it is a government that trades the democracy essence for the force, whether with guns or strength, with majorities in strategic places. They need to reassure the power of strength. With this, we have a militant society project. Bolsonaro and Bolsonarism, they represent a militant territorial that use hate and power as fuel. We have a militant society. No wonder he comes from Rio, and no wonder he is the only conservative leader in Rio, because this project started in Rio, and the militia in Brazil started in Rio. So I'll finish here and let's continue. Thank you, Freixo. We are going to now have a few specific questions to each of the participants. I'm going to start with you, Marcelo Freixo, and I'll get back to something you've said. I would like people to understand better the relationship between people and the government. Um, in some of the institutional research, we see this in Igarapé. We've noticed also that there are some attempts to advance, but things are changing. The relationship with the center parties and Bolsonaro, but nothing stops Bolsonaro from attacking the House of Representatives with anything that goes wrong with his government. I'd like to know how this relationship goes. And I want to know if you see the horizon of Bolsonaro or Bolsonarism is his goal is restricting the institutional space and to stop looking into the democracy or working on a coup or something like this. What do you think? Okay. Bolsonaro has no need for a coup. I don't think the idea of a coup is something similar to what we had in 1964. I think Bolsonarism uses the military-police relationship much more than with the army. Today, we have the Bolsonarization of the military police in Brazil, and it's a problem. Igarapé has a lot of studies on that. There are more ammunition purchases than any other time in history. This is the monopoly of strength, of power. They have an ammunition capacity that we have no idea of. We'll unfortunately soon find out. The control of allowing people to have guns is part of this project. We had two moments And just to reply very objectively, at the beginning of Governado government, we had Rodrigo Maia, and the composition of force was not Bolsonarist, and just generated some contradiction to his government. For example, the emergency allowance he offered. Uh, the parliament wanted to approve more money and Bolsonaro wanted less. So there was no other way. We managed to help mayors and governors that Bolsonaro didn't want to help. We had an anti-crime law, and with everything that happened with Ministro Sérgio Moro, we fought the anti-crime package that he proposed, and some of the things we managed to consolidate. But Bolsonaro used to say that he could not govern because of the House of Representatives. He was financed. He was financed by some structures, and this is the structure. We have a representative that is in jail now. We need to see that people are being investigated for democratic lack of democratic justice, and people who are investigated for crimes against democracy need to be further looked, because this is just not normal if you're representing democracy in the House of Representatives. Even though we have some files, we managed to have Rodrigo Maia generating some contradictions, but he managed to have some approvals, and he also managed to refrain Bolsonaro from getting into an impeachment process. And a change in parliament was starting to happen for Bolsonaro.
To tell a story, to explain something for those of you who are not familiar with it. The center brings together about 8 parties that make up the majority of the House of Representatives. And we always question them and say, it's amazing that you still support this government. And I explained all the reasons why that was wrong. And they were talking to me and agreeing with everything. And I asked, what are you going, how can you do that? And he said, well, we are for the government. What changes is the government. So that helps understand what the center is. They were always on the side of the government, whether with Fernando Henrique Cardoso, with Lula, with Dilma. And it's not that they are Bolsonarists. Until next year, everything may change. They might be able to change and help bring Bolsonaro down. But that's why this parliamentary committee of investigation, investigating COVID, the actions during COVID, is so important. Because this proves that there is corruption in the government, because that connects Bolsonaro to the old way they did politics. There are many allegations and accusations of corruption against the family of Bolsonaro, but when you have something as clear as the corruption in buying these vaccines, in which the president is involved, this is something that may change the results of this CPI, this Parliamentary Investigation Committee. But the idea, maybe I'm confusing my wishful thinking with reality, but Bolsonaro is creating a discourse and the structure to try to change the things. For example, the fight for the voting in paper. Next year's election will be the most important in the history, maybe, because it might be even more important, the Constitution of 1988. This will be violent elections, they will be dirty, and they will mark the future of Brazil for the next 30 years. So we have to be very aware of that. Thank you very much. That's perfect, Freixo. I want to ask a question to Emmanuel, continuing with our specific questions. The scenario you draw about the attack regarding the attacks to the press and the multiplication of sources of alternative realities using other systems that have always existed in democracy, but it is really data that is important. But I want to provoke you regarding how the professional press deals with all that. I was following closely a news portal that has existed for a long time, but that was doing a very good reporting work, even following the CPI for the COVID, and announced the hiring of a writer that is known for disseminating fake news, using the argument that you should listen to different voices. So shouldn't the press change its position, escaping these false symmetries that might be important to gain likes in social media or gain audience in other segments of the population, but which end up in some way naturalizing the lack of information situation? I know the situation of the press is very hard. We have a structural crisis in the communication and news system, but how can press navigate the social political reality we're living in a way that is more effective and that might restore credibility of the professional press against these trends you were mentioning, and also Freixo and Renata talked about, and which are very, very negative for, prejudicial for politics and for our situation. The theme of the lack of or of disinformation, in fact, is very complex, but it's essential. If you consider the best vaccine against the virus of disinformation, would be more journalism and quality information. In fact, everything that is being taught at schools and universities is an increased professionalism to try to regain this trust. But the violence and disinformation online is very it's an important phenomenon that is observed all around the world, and at the time it has allowed we have a flood of fake information in social media. We need to identify these narratives in the public society. Also, we have some specific narratives linked to some specific areas in political structures, guided by bots. And this work is done heavily by what we call the Committee of Hate. And then some journalists become the target and the source of misinformation. Harassment online is something that happens at global scale. is one of the greatest threats against the press. Some fights regarding information are not fought between different countries, but some organizers of the press around the world have create threats and really persecution of some other journalists who are trying to fight the lack of information with real information. One of the strengths of the Bolsonarism have to do is affecting really the health of the democratic structure. Our whole express is to mediate and to inform. And when the challenge of fighting the lack of information, of misinformation, has a lot to do a fight for us. The dissemination of the lack of misinformation comes from the government. And for example, fake news will travel and be disseminated 5 times faster than real information generated by the press. So this is another debate that is related, but it's not the central. But I wanted to bring you this information. Recent researches about the consumption of news online done in 36 countries show that less than 4 out of 10 people trust the media most of the time. This is the lowest global average. I forgot the data exactly. I'm looking for it. But that's the lowest we've come in the last 10 or 20 years. And Brazil, it's a paradox, but we show the highest level of trust, but this trust seems to reduce, and the trust in media may be associated to many aspects of the social political dynamics. And this is very much linked to the polarization you have. The systematic attack of the government against the press is one of the factors that has to be taken into account to analyze this phenomenon. And the impact of misinformation is very important. And in that sense, the hate attacks are linked and are influenced by many of the social media platforms, and who tend to shape information. And many of them tend to prioritize controversial debates. And it has to do a lot to the time the users spend online. And that's another serious problem. According to many organizations that research the theme, the logic of algorithms favor the dissemination of misinformative contents which are related to hate. Some platforms are more attentive to that, thanks to the pressure of the civil society and some government. But we still have the feeling that the attempts to try to control hate in their societies is still inefficient. The debate on the responsibility of campaigns or on attacks on social media and the dissemination of hate is a challenge for the legislative branch and for the judiciary branch. On one side, you have a pressure to make these platforms more responsible for the content they spread. And on the other hand, you have a question of censorship. But we do have some laws related to dissemination of hate, but this is a great challenge for the judiciary in terms of the number of cases to be analyzed. And so to respond to your question, to answer your question, what we can do is respond with more quality journalism, disseminating true information, real information, to fight the misinformation that is considered fact. Perfect. Thank you, Emmanuel. To end this round, I'm going to have a question for Renata. Civil society has a very important role in democracy. It is the one that organizes demands for new rights, and that's why presidents that come from a strain using the authoritarian language, some of presidents fight the civil society. And he was elected by a majority and said that he was going to end any kind of activism in the country. So this is a conundrum. So when we talk about the organizations of civil society, we see some associations that defend actions that go against human rights. I study juridical issues. We have an association of judges with an agenda that does not focus on increasing the freedom of the civil society. We also have a debate on religion on the communities. So what we called civil society seems to have been transformed in the last few years. How are you dealing with the situation, and how can we create a debate in civil society that is more receptive to democracy? Again, since the notion of civil society is being transformed lately with the emergence of these associations with these agendas.
When you think of civil society, we think of human rights and things like this, things that are more progressive. There are a series groups that not necessarily defend these rights and fundamental freedoms, and they are out there in society. I think it's a big challenge, and I remember it well. I finished my PhD in the United States, and I remember that my professor said that there is a court of common sense, and the plurality of this idea, the ideas will emerge, at least the most correct ones. I don't know if I believe this much, but to add to what Marcelo Freixo said, I was really moved about his discourse on democracy and how it is a constant crisis. I think this is it. We come from a scenario that is very frustrating, with a lot of crises, economical crisis of representative, and with big distancing between the citizen and the government, and people want immediate solutions, and democracy is not immediate. It's quite the opposite. It takes a long time because it needs to be built in a consensus, and the consensus is never going to be never going to please everyone. So this is a constant pursuit. We were looking into research from the Civis Institute, which said that 82% of the Brazilians accepted the relativization of democracy, and with the deprivation of certain freedoms, just so that they can have some of their needs fulfilled. I think we are living a very big challenge, because as a civil society, and not only that, but as society as a whole, we need to remember the fundamental values that build a fairer society. I still think uh, this way. We've created a civic space program at Igarapé in this context of attacks and difficulties, and in a context of cybersecurity, society security. They are all facing a lot of backslashes, and we are monitoring attacks, and it's just something so depressive. Let's just start looking at the answers as well. Let's look at the inspiring stories. Let's hold on to the A side of it all. We need this. Let's look at responsible leaderships, leaders who think of collectiveness, inclusion, and let's build something together. Let's look at coalitions with other organizations that have this in mind. Let's strengthen the state institutions that can look into ensuring the civil rights that we are entitled to having. Most of the times we look into the civil society. We see look into Brazil that is unequal and plural, but we need to understand that the state has a role to play. They need to ensure these types of freedoms. We'll have to look for people who are willing to ensure this. The theory of change of our institution is to produce technical material to help these people who can somehow provoke a change, and then we need to support them. So I'm just giving you all some alternative for you to know about them. We need to look into coalition with different actors and inspiring people with responsible leadership, and remind them of all these types of freedoms that we are entitled to having, and we need to keep on fighting. It is a catastrophic situation, but this is how we fight this. One of the things, okay, I'm always talking about monitoring, all right? I am a researcher, so I keep on looking at numbers throughout the day. But the physical violence monitor, for example, has low numbers, for example. Why is this increasing, though? It's because of this environment. It's because of this dissemination of discrimination speeches. It is a very good environment for this to grow. If you think of a government that is proud of insulting the opponents, you have an environment that is very fertile for these sort of ideas to grow, and they end up being fruitful. We need to do quite the opposite. We need to harvest new seeds and wait for them to bloom. And I'm playing the Pollyanna here, but I believe this is the idea. Well, thank you very much. But just to finish, we are going to have a round of questions with every one of you. One of the questions, we each one is going to receive one question to answer. We've I think we all want to keep on listening to you, of course, but we need to keep time. I'm going to read the question and then ask them in the order they appeared. The first one is with Emmanuel, and it dialogues with what Marcelo Freixo said in regard to the coming elections in 2022. Marcelo Pacheco Soares said, with the increase with the violence against the press in Brazil, is the safety of journalists going to be at stake during the presidential elections next year? Emmanuel, I don't think, Emmanuel, I don't think your answer is going to be as optimistic as Renata's answer. Well, I wish I could be optimistic, but in Brazil or in any of the country, when these are times for elections, usually the attacks to journalists increase. These are tense moments, and the journalists are here um, in the middle of the fire trying to ask questions, and they are at, targets for attacks during electoral periods. We have a lot of examples of these, especially in Latin America. Then these are tense moments, and during times like this, the journalists are going to be attacked for disclosing information that are going to bother all types of powers, religious, political, you name it. Considering the political moment of Brazil and considering the declarations that the president has already made, how these elections should be organized, I can say that the moments are going to be very difficult for journalists, and they need to prepare whatever media they represent. But it's important to say that the most vulnerable journalists in Brazil are the ones who write blogs and very local work production, and those who report local situations. They are the most vulnerable, and we are going to have more pressure put on them, and it's going to be automatic. The attacks are going to be increased, so get ready. Use your safety protocols, physical safety, cyber safety, just to anticipate the kind of attacks that you are probably going to receive. And especially virtually, and because in the virtual world, the attacks are even harder. So yes, we're going to have very hard moments. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Now a question to Marcelo Freixo. If Lula wins the election in 2022, reaffirming the formal democracy, do you think it's going to be hard because we are going to agglutinate Bolsonarism again? A question from Yogita. Well, Mateus, what can reagglutinate Bolsonarism is the victory of Bolsonaro, and I think this is the largest threat. And we live a moment in Brazil with a lot of polarization. We've been following the research because it retrofeeds itself. You can have a lot of criticism against Lula, but he is exercising his democracy. He, just the same way Bolsonaro is, he has the right to be there. The conflict between Lula and Fernando Henrique through a decade was a democratic situation that was normal. But today we are living something that is out of democracy. We need to bring politics in the center of decision of institutions. We need to ensure politics as a place where we decide things with all the contradictions it has. Just to corroborate Emmanuel, one day I was attacked. I'm not going to go further on this, but the MBL group, a right party group, they created a grotesque fake news on about me, and they apologized and they corrected it. And of course, I shared this note in which they apologized. And from a Bolsonarian group, they commented, well, Freixo, it was not truth, but it could be the truth. So we are fighting against the truth that could be, that it is not, but it could be. It's this is the type of harm on civil society. It's probably a wish, but not a fact, and it's going to be a challenge that we are going to face. Renata, I think that one thing that we called civil society through life, every time we use this term, we are talking about something that is organized. Those who present to themselves to unions and NGOs. And I'm sorry, my microphone got muted for a while. Well, we need to understand the civil society as something that is not organized because it's the basis of Bolsonarism, and this is what we have to fight against. We need to change, uh, to trade the ethics of dialogue and use this instead of the hate speech. Bolsonarismo is not about dialogue. We need to fight Bolsonaro, and we need to fight Bolsonarism with whomever we have in hand. Thank you, Freixo. And the last question is going to be to Renata, and it's the following. The shrinking space phenomenon happens all over the world. What are the peculiarities in Brazil regarding this phenomenon, and how can civil society dribble this? This is from Ana Luisa Stringini. Thank you very much for your question, Ana Luisa. There are many common things, this interference in other powers, and we see this in other places in the world. Some hate speeches, fake news. This is all very common. But there are some things in Brazil that have been enhanced, and I've said this a little earlier today to highlight. One is the intimidation and harassment to silence critical voices. This is a process of authoritarian governments that want to silence all the voices and decide on behalf of everyone. And today, and here, we'll try to stop this law from being approved. And especially this year, this is going to go against the opposition. And this is something we have been following with a lot of attention.
So this issue of being harder institutionally and trying to govern using decrees. This is something that they have been using a lot here. And I'd say that these more, when you're talking more to the pandemic, about the pandemic, it's absurd. The news we hear regarding treatments that are not effective and all the consequences it's bringing, not only in Brazil with over 500,000 people dead, and all the risks it's bringing to the health globally. What can we do? This was something I was saying in the beginning. We can resist. We've been trying also to monitor the resistance actions, but we need to identify the actors in and out of the government, looking at the media, looking at private institutions, and looking at other governments, trying to bring a coalition of actors, of like-minded people, in the defense of Brazilian democracy. We have observed during this year, when we had over 668 attacks in the public sphere, this is a very high number. Not all these attacks were able to, or could be stopped, but we can highlight some groups in the legislative branch that have done some work on that area. The judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, worked a little bit on that, and we have some executive at state and municipal level. We have some actions in that sense also. But in a larger sense, we have observed some organized civil society groups who have worked a little bit on the media. We have some international organizations. So what we have to do is go pursue this uh, allied organizations that are still resisting. And I think this might be one of the main paths we can have to try to regain the space that is so essential for us to continue to develop plurality in such an unequal, historically unequal country. Thank you, Renata. As I said, we had a short time and we're getting to the end of this time. So I would like to direct the closing of the panel, asking each one of you to make your final considerations in a time of about 3 minutes. And also ask you to recommend a documentary, a book, or another material that has inspired you, so we can inspire other people who want to go deeper into this debate. So we'll go back to the initial order, starting with Renata. Well, I'd like with a recommendation. In fact, I think we've been talking so much about democracy. I think How Democracies Die is a book that is essential if you want to understand what's happening nowadays. You asked for a recommendation, but I'm going to talk about a song that every day brings me some kind of comfort. I have twin kids, and this song by Caetano, it brings the idea of cycles. You have the morning, the afternoon, and the night, and how important it is for you to pay attention to the cycle and the beauty of this cycle. We have elected a totalitarian leader, so we need to elect another one that can bring us back to democracy. The way our current president is dealing with the pandemics is bringing a lot of danger to the world, not only in terms of health, but with this flexibilization of the access of guns to guns. This is something we have not debated yet, but I'm sure we are going to talk about tomorrow. Also, the support this government is giving to this destruction of our environment. We have elected one of the most dangerous leaders of the world. We need to acknowledge our mistakes, organize ourselves so that in some way we can germinate fruits in the realm of democracy and human rights. Thank you, Renata. You have not recommended the Igarapé Institute, so I'll take the liberty of recommending the report you have put together, because I think it's going to bring a lot of data that will complement all this information you have mentioned, and will complement what you have recommended. So I'm going to give the floor to Emmanuel. Yes. So as a final consideration, I think in very few moments in Brazilian history, a debate on the freedom of speech has been in so much in evidence, with all the attacks to journalists and all the problem with the lack of true information and the dissemination of fake news. All this will limit the access to information. It affects the right we have to the transparency regarding what the government's doing. So we have the right to be informed as a people. So freedom of press is one of the pillars of democracy. And the freedom of speech is the one that allows you to verify the existence of other freedom. And it should be a thermometer of the health of democracy, which you can measure based on the quality of the debate, public debate in a society. We are living in one of the most dramatic moments of the history of Brazil, understood here in all its complexity and diversity, going through from community organization is in all levels of society, passing through the investigation agencies and all that. But no doubt we do have a flame that we need to keep regarding this fight. Regarding these recommendations, I would like to, I don't know what would be the perfect translation, but would be the constant memory of, this would be a book that I would recommend regarding this topic. I once again want to thank the organizations to bring that has brought us such a very an interesting and important debate. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Deputado Freixo. I would like to start thanking you, Fábio, for the invitation, for the mediation. Thank all the organizations of the conference this is a very important work. Defending communication and information is something that is essential for defending democracy. Renata, I want to express all the care, how much I care about all of you. I'd like to recommend a fantastic book, which is regards the ascension of the right wing all over the world. It's called The Engineers of Chaos. It talks about the rise of this all over the world. It's the best book I read on Bolsonarism. And I'd like to recommend a book by Laurentino Ramos called The Slavery. I read the volume 1. I'm reading volume 2. And that is very essential for understanding what's happening in Brazil. And where I would like to talk about the Republic of the Militia. It's a very important book that analyzes from extermination groups all the way to Bolsonaro, and it helps us understand what is happening in Rio, which is a mirror of what's happening all over the world. It's called the Republic of the Militias. And then we have a book called People of God. If you don't understand how the poor population sees the religion. It's a brilliant book by Julian Spauer. And this is essential for us to be able to talk to the poorer part of our population. And talking about music, I'd like to recommend two songs by Chico Buarque. One is Vai Passar, and the other one is Apesar de Você. I think I don't need to explain why I mentioned these two books, but I like to close with these recommendations. Thank you very much, Freixo. You have recommended so many books. I introduced you as a professor, and that is very typical of a professor. And you've also mentioned therapy. Therapy helps us face our biggest fears, our biggest demons, our deceptions with ourselves. But it also helps us transform this process and transform all that in something that is focused on action so we can build a new future for all of us. So let's hope that we can leave this panel and this conference with this therapeutical legacy and bring that to Brazil and try to transform all that into something that is really able to restore our democracy, the commitment to health, of preserving the environment, and protecting all those who are the target and the victim of all this process our country has gone through. Our original is breaking a little bit. I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to moderate such a beautiful, a fantastic panel, and goodbye, everybody.